I'm really anxious now we can return to a very important subject of some of the major international issues that are going on. And Nick, I didn't give an adequate introduction. I'm probably not going to do it now either, but he has, several decades of superb experience working with a wide range of NGOs, of major Fortune 50 companies on a whole host of issues that are critical to our industry. And he's right now got on his plate some very, very key things that are at a point of really critical decision making. So, Nick, please continue. Sorry to interrupt it all.
That's all right. Right, so for 2012, I would say there are three main issues which should be a particular concern to the ICT sector. The first is foreign governments advancing the agenda that they've been pursuing for a decade to move internet policy from private sector-led institutions like ICANN to intergovernmental institutions, principally the International Telecommunications Union. The potential for liberalization of trade and services at the WTO, and the negotiations underway to extend the coverage of the Information Technology Agreement for new classes of hardware. For example, tablet computers are not covered by the ITA, and this is one of the things they're talking about adding. Those negotiations are actually going pretty well. And the third is the World Intellectual Property Organization's leadership and his efforts to get member governments to engage on intermediary liability in both copyright and trademarks. I'm guessing that pretty much everybody has read Commissioner McDowell's article on the World Conference on Telecommunications, or any of the other articles on the similar topic. This is, for short, we call this WICIT, WCIT. This is the concern is justifiable. The WICIT conference's objective is to modify the International Telecommunications Regulations, or ITRs, which were last amended in 1988, and they govern things like peering and termination in telecommunications, as well as rates, the process by which those are determined for international traffic. So because this is a treaty-making exercise or a treaty modification exercise, if countries were to propose specific regulations that related to the way in which internet traffic is exchanged between countries, it would create a nexus for decision-making about the internet at the ITU. And I'm not sure that all the articles about WICIT have actually made clear what WICIT is and why it has become such a concern. The reason why this is interesting to someone like me, because this has made the efforts of the ITU to control the internet sort of the subject of active debate in the United States and in other countries. The irony is, this is a 10-year-old problem. WICIT is one battle in a war that really has been underway for a decade in Geneva, by which countries like Russia and China are very single-mindedly pursuing an agenda to control what is said on the internet for very obvious reasons. And they're very good at it. They're very good at venue shopping. The Indian government, who are not always our friends in this, in proposing an internet agency, suggested that one of the reasons why we should all be happy with a new UN agency that controls the internet is because there are currently 36 UN agencies who are discussing the internet. And when the Indian permanent representative in Geneva put to me that this would make my job easier because there would only be one place to turn, I said, Your Excellency, I'm sorry. All that means is there will be 37 places for us to go to discuss internet policy. And he laughed and he said, well, you may have something there, but it's still a good idea. It's not a good idea, but it's a popular one. What I would say is the reason why this has become such a big issue now is really something of a perfect storm. I think everyone is familiar with the use of social media to change governments in the Middle East, which I'm sure most of us welcome. WikiLeaks publishing thousands of diplomatic cables, mostly of a more titillating interest than anything else. Internet activism to stop the SOPA and PIPA legislation in the United States is obviously of concern to countries which don't want their citizens protesting the laws that they are proposing to make. ICANN announcing that it would open applications for new TLDs, and the announcement by the holder of the XXX TLD that they are applying for .sex, .porn, and .adult to add to XXX. There are a lot of countries which want none of those extensions to enter their country. And they use ICANN and what goes on there as a reason why other countries should support them in saying, you just can't let the private sector run these things. If governments were in charge, we'd never have something like this. So the result really is that countries see the internet really more as a threat. And from their perspective, they don't want activists overthrowing them or their friends. They don't want what they see as predominantly US-based companies controlling access to the information of their citizens. And they resent the fact that they have to ask those companies for access to their information that their nationals put on those services. And they object to a US-headquartered company in ICANN potentially inserting into the public internet in their countries new TLDs that they object to on moral or other grounds. Unfortunately, this is all happening in a vacuum of knowledge amongst diplomats, most of whom come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who are interested in politics and not policy, and who don't really understand technology and aren't really interested in whether the result of their discussions leads to good policy. They're interested in scoring diplomatic points, and in a number of cases, they're interested in scoring them against the West, because that is the game that has been played for the last 30 or 40 years. And there are a number of countries which should know better, like India, that continue to play it, even though their ministries at home disagree completely with the policies that they pursue. They're unable to prevent it because they either don't know that it's happening, because their own stakeholders don't know what is happening in Geneva. So the people at home cannot go to their ministry and say, why is Foreign Affairs doing something that's directly against the interests of our own companies? And they have a pretty simple message, that if governments take control of internet policy, they can put a stop to everything from activism that threatens them to spam, cybercrime, child porn, and whistleblowing. And the leadership of UN agencies like WIPO and the ITU are only too happy to fan these flames because they look relevant as institutions if they're discussing and agreeing upon internet policy. Which is why 36 agencies are discussing the internet. It's not because there's a natural agenda for them to discuss there at all. So just to go over the other battles, of which Wicked is one, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and others are promoting what they call a cyber arms control treaty. Think about that for a moment and see if you can imagine what that actually is. The objective of this is not to actually stop the weaponization of cyberspace. It's to extend the convention that already exists that in wartime, governments can make decisions about what civil society can do and say in the interests of national security. So if they extend these rules to the internet, it means they can say, I'm sorry, but you can't make that statement. It's against national security. It's really censorship in the guise of arms control, which reminds me a little of Colonel Gaddafi sponsoring human rights prizes. In 2011, Russia, China, and others proposed an information security resolution at the UN in New York, which has a 12-point code of conduct, which weaves widely agreeable objectives together with broad endorsements of state control over internet content, and this will get discussed at the General Assembly later this year. At WIPO, to my surprise, right in front of me, the Russians went through this long discourse on how file sharing was sort of the scourge of the world. All of us who are listening to this were going, well, but we know that the Russians aren't interested at all in file sharing or actually copyright. Where is he going with this? So where he was going with this is that the objective of WIPO's enforcement work on file sharing should be to curb the dissemination of information on the internet. Wonderful. This is just what we need. India and Brazil and South Africa have proposed the creation of a new UN body that would develop and establish international public policies for the internet and integrate and oversee the bodies responsible for technical and operational functioning of the internet, including global standard setting. This is the 37th UN agency. Unfortunately, industry has been pretty disengaged with all of this for all of this time and has only become interested really in the last few months. And I guess what my message to you is better said by a good friend of mine who represents one of Europe's largest telecommunications providers, who when I told him that I was coming here and that I would be speaking about this, he said, tell them that if they engage now, they may not have a major win in 6 months, but if they don't take sustained action, in 6 years, they may not have a business. And I mean, that sounds very alarming, but I don't think that's entirely untrue. You might have a different business. You might have a much smaller business. You wouldn't have the internet that is open for ideas and entrepreneurship that you have now. That is certainly the case. If the Russian and Chinese model of top-down control is the one that is bought into. So now that I sound like the prophet of doom, on the World Trade Organization, there's a much better story to tell. Now that the member states have agreed that the Doha round is finished, the WTO is free from spending another 10 years fighting about agriculture. Well, I'm sure they will continue to fight about agriculture for the next 10 years, but that's not all they will do. There's a group of 19 countries which was started, and this effort was started by the United States to discuss trade in services and the liberalization of trade in services. And the idea that most interests them is the free flow of data on the internet, of creating an internet services agreement. And they're arguing about will it apply on an MFN basis or not? Will it be, part of the GATT system directly or by reference? We had a lunch that we sponsored where Vintsurf met with 10 of the ambassadors, an additional 4 countries' perm reps, and then counselors from the remainder of the 19, just on Tuesday. And I have to tell you, they really want to do something. And, Vint said to them, look, can't you guys, we have something called beta testing. We actually try things out in the private sector, and if they don't work, we fix them. Can't you have, sort of a time-limited agreement or something and create an internet free trade zone? And you could see the lights going off. I mean, they really liked this idea. And I think if you're going to have a goal in trade related to internet services, this is a good goal, to start with the idea of the internet as a real free trade zone, and then only retreat from openness via specific commitments. So that's the first part of the opportunity. They all really need to hear, though, from not only, the US is basically on side, they get it. The people who need to hear are the people in other countries, to have their ICT sector stakeholders saying, this is a good idea, you should try this. You should try something new. We have a benefit in this. Influencing WTO negotiations is not the easiest thing to do, especially for a sector like ours, which is not always super coordinated. But we've got an open door to educate the world's trade negotiating community over what innovation means in the ICT sector. They want to hear from you all. They want to hear from all of us. And they're willing to try new things. One of the diplomats asked Vintsurf, what do you like? What makes Silicon Valley so special? Everybody wants one. Not surprisingly. And he said, well, one of the things that makes it special is if you fail in business in Silicon Valley, it's not the end of your business career. It's just seen as a learning experience. People will still take a risk on you. And I forget which ambassador it was, looked at Vint and said, well, we've got 10 years of experience with failing, so we should be perfect for you for this model. But it was really, there's a really good atmosphere there, and when you talk to USTR, comment and tell them that you like to see that they're trying to push forward in services. It's a good thing. The other main WTO-related thing is the Information Technology Agreement, which is celebrating its 15th anniversary on May 15th. And as I said, they're extending it to additional product categories for hardware. which is, I think, good for our sector also. It's kind of crazy that mobile phones are covered, but tablet computers aren't. But it's simply because it's been 15 years since those lists were updated. The last area I would say is international IP. And this could be a good news story, or it can be a bad news story. It all depends on whether WIPO is left alone to come up with new and interesting things, or whether we decide that we want to implement an agenda instead of allowing the Secretariat to do it. There are a number of countries that are interested in how to get a piece of the knowledge economy. But they don't really know how to do this, and WIPO's response is that, I don't really know where they came out with this, but their response is basically just look at the role and responsibility of internet intermediaries. In copyright, the Director General believes, according to a speech that I sat and watched him give, that the internet treaties should be modified to rebalance safe harbor regimes, and that the community of rights holders should work with WIPO to help create a positive agenda for doing that. In trademarks, he suggested that regulating the content of search results, social media, and online marketplaces is a necessary public policy response to counterfeiting. Wherever you come out on intermediary liability, I hope we can all agree that having a UN agency decide what can be said, sold, or found online is not the right policy response. On the opportunity side, as you all know, ICANN is about to dramatically expand the domain name space. And there's a lot of controversy about especially the trademark protection mechanisms and whether this is going to just simply be a way for trademark holders to be asked to pay for an endless number of defensive registrations. At the same time, there are no common rules to handle disputes related to the names that are registered. Generic names like .com are dealt with by the UDRP. Country code names have no obligation to have any dispute handling system at all. New generic names, like .brands, will have the UDRP and an additional system. So it's sort of the worst of all worlds in that you have a very large expansion of a very unharmonized system in which some people do nothing to protect the interests of trademarks, and others are required to do quite a lot. And there's a lot of interest in companies to actually say, well, one thing WIPO has done well is administer the UDRP. Maybe we could look at some common elements for brand protection across all TLDs, because ICANN has no ability to affect policy at the country code TLD level. And at the moment, anyway, that's 230-odd TLDs, anything with 2 digits. There's only half a dozen GTLDs, really. Of course, it's about to change. So having some level of commonality in terms of defending your interests and in looking across TLDs, instead of simply looking at individual cases in individual TLDs, which could be for the same names, which creates sort of a venue hopping environment. In copyright, WIPO's member states are currently discussing exceptions and limitations for the blind, for education, and for libraries. But there are a number of member states who are really interested in talking about how copyright is used in innovation-related industries like the ICT sector. And I would suggest to you that since there are so many countries which are looking at revising their copyright systems to take account of the online world, and that at WIPO, twice a year, the heads of the US Library of Congress and every other equivalent agency in the world fly to Geneva to meet and talk about this. It presents a wonderful forum to talk about how copyright is actually used in our sector in different ways by different stakeholders, so that at least when this is being discussed, it's not discussed in an intellectual vacuum. And to quote Ian Hargreaves, the author of the UK Copyright Review, that we aren't looking at policy-based evidence-making, but evidence-based policy-making. In 20 years, we may remember nothing about the Hargreaves report but that phrase. The bottom line is that we can't really leave, we can leave WIPO alone, but their track record of coming up with ideas that actually work for our sector is very poor. And then it will become a problem that has to be solved, like happened with trademarks last year when they attempted to regulate all content for trademarks. But if we stay engaged, we have a chance to actually drive an agenda that works for our sector instead of for everyone else. Like Brussels some years ago, and even Washington not so long ago as far as many companies in our sector were concerned, Geneva is no longer a place that we can just ignore. It's like rolling the dice and hoping that you get a good result. At the moment, CCIA are the only full-time representatives of any ICT sector association that have a presence in Geneva. We joke, me and my colleague Matthias, about this because there's a few countries that only have 2 or 3 delegates, and so we compare notes on how stretched we are. But it's very much to CCI's credit, I think, I have to say, that it decided to be first and to blaze a trail. I fully expect in a few years I may wish a bunch of people had left, but at the moment we're the only ones there. And I really thank Ed for, and my colleagues for the foresight to be first. Most people don't like to be first. They'd rather follow than lead. So I'm a lucky man. I have a good job defending the internet feels like being in an NGO really when you're talking about free expression. And my NGO friends go, what is this? I get paid nothing, and you actually get paid decently, and you're saying the same thing I'm saying. How do I get your job? And I said, I don't know.
Nick, thank you very much. Everyone know we have about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit more for some questions. I want to make sure we have that opportunity. Congressman Issa is on his way then. But I did want people to have a chance to interact and ask you some questions. I know you've got a tremendous amount of info to continue to
Oh, no, I'm
impart.
Done. That was it. Your timing was perfect. I was finished.
So let me open it up to any questions.
Hi, Nick. I'm glad the CCIA's got you over there keeping an eye on Europe, because if you work on the internet, you're global, like it or not. You got a little website, you got business in Europe if you got something they like. Curious, we had the top level domain TLD that we keep talking about, the acronym for, .com, .net, or top level domains. And the EU several years ago created the .eu domain. And you had to, prior to that, if you say had datafoundry.com in the United States, you needed to go country by country to get the TLD and to apply for trademark protection. And what that system did was allow you to get one trademark, and therefore, if you could prevail over somebody that, say, had datafoundry.de for Germany. And they had a system, which I don't know if ICANN's going to do this with their GTLDs, and that is they gave folks that already had a trademark on the core prefix to the TLD a grace period to apply, and would have a preference in time by applying for that domain. Is there any talk of that? I mean, I thought it was pretty rational. We applied for .eu, and we already had it trademarked, and we had, attorneys in the Netherlands still use them. And then we pushed off the German interloper, who was trading on the name, but we didn't have to file a lawsuit. He just saw, the EU regimen, and that it was inevitable we would win. It's just a question, and he assigned it back to us. So I saw that system work for us, cost us counsel in Europe, which is cheaper than here. And are you seeing that? Or
well, I mean, you can talk for a long time about the new GTLD program and how it works. There are greater protections for exactly the scenario that you are mentioning in the new GTLD program. there's also a considerable amount of latitude depending on the type of TLD that is being applied for in the new GTLD round. There are additional protections, it's true, but it's not really the same as, oh, I can apply in one place and protect myself across all TLDs. This is one of the big shortcomings. But I think I'm being...
Have a seat here and you guys can take it.
Yeah.